Beneath the dazzling lights of the elite, where power and wealth cloak the deepest secrets, a man who seemed untouchable confronts a past he buried for 30 years. A mysterious little girl, a scribbled note, and a truth that turns everything upside down. Does real honor lie at the pinnacle of success or in the small things he once left behind? Dive into this emotional journey where self-respect and family collide in a tale you won't want to miss. Hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss a single twist. The air on the 72nd floor of Caldwell Industries shimmered with the weight of success. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago River glittered under a twilight sky, its surface a mirror for the city's towering ambition. Inside, the office gleamed, polished walnut desk, a single crystal tumbler of amber whiskey catching, the glow of recessed lights, and Henry Caldwell, 60 years old, standing at the helm of it all. His gray suit, tailored to perfection, hugged his broad shoulders, a silent testament to the discipline that had forged his empire. Tonight, he'd signed a deal worth billions, a fusion energy project that would cement his legacy as a titan of industry. The ink was still wet on the contract when the door swung open. "Mr. Caldwell," his assistant Margaret said, her voice crisp yet deferential. "The celebration's ready downstairs. They're waiting for you." Henry nodded, adjusting his cufflinks with a practiced flick. He didn't smile. Smiles were for men who needed approval, and Henry Caldwell needed none. He'd built Caldwell Industries from a single failing refinery into a behemoth of renewable energy, a feat that demanded steel nerves and a heart that didn't waver. As he stepped into the private elevator, the hum of its descent matched the steady rhythm of his breath. Control was everything. The ballroom below buzzed with Chicago's elite, suits and sequins, champagne flutes clinking like a symphony of wealth. Chandeliers cast golden light across the crowd, their prisms refracting a glow that made every face look triumphant. Henry moved through the throng, shaking hands with calculated precision, his deep voice cutting through the chatter with measured words of gratitude. "Thank you for your trust," he said to a silver-haired investor. "This is just the beginning," he assured a tech mogul in a velvet blazer. Each phrase was a brick in the wall of his reputation. Then, a small figure slipped through the sea of tailored legs, a girl no more than 10, her brown hair tangled and her coat patched at the elbows. She clutched a crumpled notebook, her sneakers scuffing the marble floor. The room didn't notice her, but Henry did. She stopped a few feet from him, her wide eyes catching the chandelier's light like twin stars. Mr. Caldwell?" Her voice was soft, trembling at the edges. "Can I have your autograph?" The question landed like a pebble in a still pond, rippling through his composure. Henry's jaw tightened. He wasn't a celebrity signing posters. He was a man of substance, not sentiment. "I don't do autographs," he said, his tone flat, final. He turned to move away, but her eyes held him, large, brown, and achingly familiar. A memory flickered. Clara, his daughter, at 9, standing by the door as he packed a suitcase, her small voice pleading, "Daddy, don't go!" He'd walked out anyway, convinced love was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Excuse me," he muttered, stepping past her. But the girl didn't retreat. She fumbled in her pocket, pulling out a scrap of paper and pressing it into his hand before darting back into the crowd. Henry glanced at it, a child's scrawl in blue crayon. "Mom says you're important." His fingers closed around it, the paper crumpling in his grip. Important to whom? The thought gnawed at him, an itch he couldn't scratch. Henry Caldwell, the man of the hour. The voice was smooth, edged with mockery, cutting through his reverie. Victor Marshall stood there, a glass of red wine in hand, his silver hair slicked back, his smile a blade. At 62, Victor was a relic of Henry's past, a rival who'd lost a critical energy bid to him 25 years ago, a defeat that had festered into a quiet vendetta. "Quite the empire you've built," Victor said, his eyes glinting. "Dignity suits you, or is it just a mask?" Henry's pulse quickened, but his face remained a stone wall. He'd faced Victor's barbs before, Public jabs at galas, whispered rumors in boardrooms. Control was his shield. "I don't live for the opinions of losers," he replied, his voice low, steady. "Enjoy the wine, Victor. It's the best you'll get tonight." Victor chuckled, a sound like breaking glass, and leaned closer. "You're good at hiding your past, Henry, but not good enough." He turned away, melting into the crowd, leaving the words to hang like smoke. Henry's hand tightened around the tumbler of whiskey he'd picked up from a passing tray. The amber liquid trembled faintly, betraying the storm beneath his calm. Victor knew something, or thought he did. The past was a locked vault. One Henry had buried deep. The wife he'd left, the daughter he'd abandoned, the life he'd traded for power. He'd told himself it was necessary. His father had been a drunk, a failure who'd lost everything, and Henry swore he'd never follow that path. Success was his dignity, his proof of worth. But those eyes, that girl, Lily, he'd heard someone call her, had stirred something he couldn't name. He slipped the crumpled note into his pocket, the edges digging into his palm. The gala spun on around him, a whirl of laughter and clinking glasses, but Henry felt detached, a shadow among the lights. He drained the whiskey in one swallow, the burn grounding him. Control, he reminded himself. That was his strength. Whatever Victor hinted at, whatever this girl meant, he'd face it on his terms. As he stepped toward the podium to deliver his speech, the note pressed against his thigh. A silent question he couldn't yet answer. The crowd applauded, their faces a blur of admiration, but Henry's mind lingered on a single image. Clara, small and sobbing, framed by a doorway he'd closed forever, or so he'd thought. The lights above burned bright, but beneath them, something long buried flickered to life, a spark of doubt, a whisper of regret. The Lakeshore Drive mansion stood like a monument to Henry Caldwell's triumph, its stone facade glowing faintly under the Chicago moon. Inside, the living room stretched wide and silent, a cavern of wealth. Marble floors polished to a mirror sheen, a grand fireplace crackling with logs that cost more than most people's rent, and bookshelves lined with annual reports instead of novels. Henry sat in a leather armchair, the crumpled note from Lily still clutched in his hand, its blue crayon scrawl a stark contrast to the sterile elegance around him. The gala's noise had faded hours ago, but Victor Marshall's words, "You're good at hiding your past," looped in his mind like a taunt he couldn't shake. He smoothed the paper against his knee, the words, "Mom says you're important," staring back at him. Important to whom? The question gnawed, a splinter under his carefully manicured control. Henry rose, the whiskey tumbler from earlier refilled and balanced in his other hand, and paced to the window. The city sprawled below, a constellation of lights he'd helped shape. 30 years ago, he'd walked away from a crumbling house. In Cicero, from a wife who loved him too softly and a daughter who trusted him too much. He'd told himself it was for their sake, to spare them the chaos of his father's failures, the old man who'd drowned in bourbon and debt. Success was his shield, his dignity. But tonight, that shield felt thin. The note trembled as he set it on the mantel, next to a framed photo of him shaking hands with a senator, a trophy of his ascent. He took a sip of whiskey, the burn sharp against his throat, and let his gaze drift to the bookshelf. Something caught his eye. A slim, faded envelope wedged between two leather-bound reports, its edges yellowed like old bone. He hadn't touched that shelf in years. Margaret handled the decor. Curiosity tugged at him, a rare breach in his discipline. He pulled it free, dust scattering into the firelight. The handwriting on the front stopped his breath. To Daddy, from Clara. His daughter's script, uneven and childlike, from a time before he'd become Henry Caldwell, titan of industry. He sank back into the chair, the envelope unopened in his lap, the whiskey forgotten on the armrest. Memories flooded in, unbidden. Clara at 11, her brown curls bouncing as she ran to him with a drawing, her voice high and bright. "Look, Daddy, it's us." He'd smiled then, a real smile before the weight of his father's ghost drove him out the door. He'd left her with a promise. "I'll build something better for you." But he hadn't looked back. His fingers traced the seal, hesitating. Control, he reminded himself. Emotions were a luxury for weaker men. But the note, from Lily, those eyes so like Clara's, had cracked something open. He tore the envelope, the sound loud in the stillness, and unfolded a single sheet of lined paper, dated 25 years ago. "Dear Daddy," it began, the ink smudged in spots, as if tears had fallen as she wrote. "Mom says you're busy, making the world better, but I miss you. I got an A in math today and I wanted to show you. Are you coming home soon? I keep your chair empty at dinner. Love, Clara." Henry's chest tightened, a vice squeezing out the air. He read it again, each word a pinprick against the armor he'd worn for decades. She'd waited for him, his little girl, with her drawings and her trust, had waited while he chased a legacy to bury his shame. He'd never seen that A, never sat in that chair again. The whiskey glass slipped from the armrest, shattering on the marble with a sound like a gunshot, but he didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on the letter, the past rising like smoke. From ashes, he'd thought long cold. Why now? The question clawed at him. Victor's jab at the gala, Lily's sudden appearance, this letter surfacing after years. It couldn't be coincidence. Victor had always been a snake, coiled and patient, striking when the moment was ripe. Did he know about Clara? Had he dug into Henry's buried life to weaponize it? The thought stirred a flicker of anger, but Henry tamped it down, his jaw clenching. Instead, anger was weakness. Control was strength. He'd built an empire on that truth. He stood, pacing to the fireplace, the letter still in hand. The flames danced, casting shadows that stretched across the room like ghosts. Clara's face floated there, 9 years old, then 11, then gone. He hadn't seen her since she was a child, hadn't wanted to see the disappointment in her eyes. His wife, Ellen, had pleaded with him to stay, her voice soft but firm. "We don't need money, Henry, we need you." He'd walked out anyway, convinced love was a trap, a distraction from the discipline that kept him sane. Ellen had died years later. He'd read it in a newspaper clipping, a brief mention of a woman he'd once promised forever. He hadn't gone to the funeral. Dignity, he'd told himself, was in moving forward. But this letter, this relic of a girl who'd loved him, shattered that lie. Dignity wasn't in the billions he'd amassed or the headlines he'd claimed. It was in the empty chair at a dinner table he'd never returned to. And Lily, who was she? The note suggested a connection, a thread to Clara he couldn't ignore. His mind raced, piecing it together. The girl's eyes, the timing, Victor's smirk. Was she Clara's daughter? His granddaughter? Henry folded the letter, slipping it into his pocket beside Lily's note. The whiskey shards glinted on the floor, a mess he'd leave for the maid. He stepped to the window again, the city's lights blurring through a sheen he refused to call tears. Control, he thought, steadying his breath. He wouldn't storm out or confront Victor, not yet. He'd face this on his terms, with the same resolve that had built his empire. But as he stood there, the fire's warmth fading at his back, a quiet truth settled in. The past wasn't buried, it was alive, and it had found him under the lights he'd climbed so high to reach. The wind off the Chicago River carried a bite as Henry Caldwell stepped out of his chauffeured Bentley, the sleek black car a stark intruder on the cracked pavement of this quiet Queens neighborhood. He adjusted his coat against the late autumn chill, the wool heavy with the scent of his cologne, a shield of refinement against the world he'd left behind. The address had come from a discreet inquiry to his assistant Margaret, who'd traced the gala's uninvited guest Lily to this modest brick building. Henry hadn't slept since finding Clara's letter. The weight of her words, "I keep your chair empty," pressed against his ribs like a bruise he couldn't ignore. He had to know. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, its door chipped and painted a faded blue. From within came the soft hum of a radio, a jazz tune weaving through the air like a thread of memory. Henry hesitated, his hand hovering over the brass knocker. He wasn't a man who knocked. Doors opened for him, always had. But this wasn't his world. He rapped twice, the sound sharp in the stillness, and waited. The door creaked open, revealing a woman in a paint-splattered apron, her dark hair pulled into a loose bun. Clara Caldwell stood there, 36 now, her brown eyes, once so trusting, narrowed with a hardness Henry didn't recognize. She was thinner than he remembered, her hands roughened by work, but her posture held a quiet strength, like a tree weathered but unbroken. Behind her, the small living room glowed with warmth, walls lined with oil paintings of rivers and faces, a sagging couch draped with a quilt, and a wooden table bearing a half-eaten loaf of homemade bread. "Clara," Henry said, his voice steady, despite the tremor in his chest. "It's me." Her gaze flickered over him, his tailored coat, his polished shoes, then locked onto his face. "You don't get to call me that," she said, her tone cold as the river outside. "What are you doing here?" Before he could answer, a small figure darted from behind her, Lily, her tangled hair bouncing as she clutched a worn rag doll. "Mom, who's— oh!" She stopped, staring up at Henry with those familiar eyes, bright and curious. "You're the man from the TV, the one who makes big things." Clara's hand shot out, pulling Lily back. "Go finish your drawing, honey," she said, her voice softening for the girl but hardening again as she turned to Henry. "You've got 5 minutes. Say what you came to say, then leave." Henry stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind him. The air smelled of turpentine and yeast, a far cry from the sterile leather and whiskey of his mansion. He glanced at the paintings, vivid strokes of blue and gold, raw with emotion, and felt a pang he couldn't name. "I saw her at the gala," he said, nodding toward Lily, who'd retreated to a corner with her crayons. "She left me a note. Said her mom thought I was important. I had to see if it was you." Clara crossed her arms, her apron crinkling. "Important?" She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You were important when I was 9, crying at the door while you packed your bags. You were important when Mom got sick, and I begged you to come back. You chose money over us, Henry Caldwell. Don't pretend you care now." Her words cut deep, each one a shard of glass lodging in his pride. He'd expected anger, but not this. This quiet, controlled fury, sharper than any shout. He wanted to argue, to say he'd left to protect them, to build something stable after his father's ruin had left him scarred. But the excuse felt hollow here, in this room where Clara had raised a child alone, where bread was baked by hand and walls told stories of survival. "I didn't know about your mother," he said, his voice low, measured. "Not until last night. I found a letter, yours from when you were 11. I didn't mean to—" "Didn't mean to what?" Clara interrupted, stepping closer, her eyes blazing. "Didn't mean to abandon us? Didn't mean to let Mom die waiting for you? I took care of her, Henry, me, a teenager, while you were off building your empire. Don't stand here acting like a letter changes that." Henry's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. Control was his anchor. He wouldn't let it slip, not even under this barrage. "I'm not here to change the past," he said. "I can't. I just wanted to see you, to know you're alive, that she's alive." He glanced at Lily, who peeked over her drawing, her doll tucked under her chin. Clara followed his gaze, her expression softening for a moment, before hardening again. "Lily doesn't know you," she said, "and she doesn't need to. I've given her everything you didn't, love, time, a home. You don't get to walk in here and claim her." "I'm not claiming anything," Henry replied, his hands clasped behind his back to steady them. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Clara. I saw her eyes, and I knew. She's my granddaughter, isn't she?" Clara's silence was answer enough, her lips pressing into a thin line. The jazz on the radio swelled, a mournful saxophone filling the space between them. Henry felt the weight of it, the years he'd lost, the family he'd traded for a legacy of steel and glass. Dignity, he'd called it, but standing here, it felt like cowardice. "Get out," Clara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper but firm as stone. "You don't belong here." Henry nodded, a single deliberate motion. He wouldn't. Push wouldn't let emotion unravel him. "I'll go," he said. "But I'm not the man I was, Clara. Not entirely." He turned, his hand on the doorknob, then paused. "She's a beautiful girl. You've done well." Clara didn't respond, her back to him as she moved to the table, picking up a knife to slice the bread. A small, defiant act of normalcy. Lily waved shyly from her corner, and Henry offered a faint nod, the closest he could come to a smile. The door closed behind him, the cold air hitting his face like a slap. As he descended the stairs, Clara's words echoed. "You chose money. Over us." They stung, but they were true. He'd run from his father's shame, built a fortress of wealth and called it honor. But honor wasn't in the billions or the headlines. It was in that cramped apartment, in a mother's fierce love, in a child's innocent wave. Henry slid into the Bentley, the leather seat cold against his back, and stared at the crumpled note in his pocket. The past wasn't just alive. It was demanding something from him, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he could control the answer. The Peninsula Hotel's grand ballroom shimmered with opulence, its chandeliers dripping crystal like frozen tears over a sea of tuxedos and silk gowns. Henry Caldwell stood near the edge of the room, a glass of untouched sparkling water in hand, the bubbles rising like tiny protests against the weight of the evening. Tonight was a charity gala for renewable energy innovation, a cause he'd championed for decades, and the air buzzed with the clink of glasses and the murmur of Chicago's elite. He'd worn his charcoal suit, the one that made him look unyielding, a pillar of industry. But beneath the crisp fabric, Clara's words from yesterday, "You chose money over us," burned hotter than any spotlight. He'd barely slept, the image of her paint-stained hands and Lily's shy wave haunting him. The Bentley ride back from Queens had been silent, the city lights blurring into a smear of regret. He'd built Caldwell Industries to escape his father's failures, to prove he could control his fate. Dignity, he'd told himself, was in the empire he'd forged. But Clara's apartment, with its homemade bread and resilient warmth, had cracked that certainty. Now, standing here among the glittering crowd, he felt like a man on trial, judged by a jury he couldn't see. "Henry, you've outdone yourself." A portly man in a bow tie clapped him on the shoulder, his voice loud with champagne. "This fusion project, it's the future. Your legacy's set." Henry nodded, his lips curving into the practiced half-smile he'd mastered over decades. "Thank you, George, it's a team effort." The words were automatic, a shield against the storm brewing inside. He scanned the room, catching glimpses of familiar faces, investors, board members, a senator he'd golfed with last spring. They saw him as a titan, a man of honor. But honor felt fragile tonight, a word he couldn't define. Then the murmur shifted, a ripple of unease spreading through the crowd. Heads turned toward a flat screen mounted near the bar, its glow cutting through the chandelier's gold. A news anchor's voice sliced into the room, polished and predatory. "Breaking news from Chicago. Caldwell Industries titan, Henry Caldwell, faces allegations of a hidden past. Sources claim he abandoned a family decades ago, raising questions about the man behind the empire." Henry's grip tightened on the glass, the cold biting into his palm, but his face remained a mask of stone. The screen flashed a grainy photo. Him, younger, sterner, stepping out of a car in the 90s, a file image from some forgotten archive. The anchor continued. "An anonymous tip suggests Caldwell has a daughter he's kept secret, casting a shadow over his pristine reputation. We go live to Victor Marshall, a longtime rival, for comment." Victor's face filled the screen, his silver hair gleaming under studio lights, his smile a razor's edge. "Henry Caldwell's built a fortune, on dignity," he said, his voice smooth as venom. "But what kind of man leaves a wife and child to chase power? The world deserves to know the truth behind the mask." The room went quiet, the clinking glasses stilled. Eyes darted to Henry, some curious, some accusing, others veiled with polite shock. George stepped back, his bow tie bobbing as he swallowed. Henry felt the weight of every stare, 1,000 needles pricking at his pride. Victor had struck, and struck deep. The old rivalry, born when Henry outbid him for a refinery contract 25 years ago, had festered into this. A public execution of his character. His pulse thudded, a drumbeat urging him to act, to storm the stage, to call Victor a liar, to demand the cameras turn off. But Henry didn't move. Control was his strength, the steel thread that had held him together through boardroom battles and personal losses. He wouldn't give Victor the satisfaction of seeing him crack. He set the glass down on a passing tray, the motion deliberate, and straightened his tie. "Henry, is this true?" A woman in a sapphire gown approached, her voice hushed but insistent. "Did you really—" "It's a distraction," he cut in, his tone even, authoritative. "Victor's playing a game he's already lost. My focus is on the work. Clean, energy, jobs, progress. That's what matters." He met her gaze, unflinching, and she nodded, retreating with a murmured apology. But inside, the ground shifted. Victor knew about Clara. How, Henry couldn't guess, but the timing was too precise, the wound too raw. The letter from Clara, Lily's note, the visit to Queens. It all pointed to a leak, a betrayal he hadn't seen coming. His mind raced. Had someone from his past talked? Had Victor hired investigators? The thought stoked a flicker of anger, but he smothered it, breathing slow and deep. Anger was a luxury he couldn't afford. He crossed the room to a quieter corner, pulling his phone from his pocket. The screen glowed with missed calls. Margaret, his PR team, a dozen unknowns. He silenced it, slipping it back into his coat. He'd face this, but not in a panic. Dignity wasn't in the headlines or Victor's sneers. It was in how he stood now, shoulders squared, head high. "Mr. Caldwell?" A young waiter approached, nervous, holding a tablet. "They're asking for a statement downstairs. The press is swarming." "Tell them I'll speak when I'm ready," Henry said, his voice calm, final. The waiter nodded and scurried off, leaving Henry alone with the hum of the crowd and the echo of Victor's words. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing the folded edges of Clara's letter, a tether to the truth he couldn't dodge. The gala resumed its rhythm, laughter, clinking glasses. But Henry felt apart from it, a man caught between two worlds. The upper-class sheen of this room with its champagne and chandeliers clashed with the memory of Clara's paint-splattered apron, Lily's rag doll. He'd chosen this life, money, power, control, over them. Victor's attack wasn't just a lie. It was a mirror, reflecting a choice Henry had buried under decades of success. He stepped to the window, the city sprawling below like a map of his victories. But victory felt hollow tonight. Dignity, he'd always thought, was in the empire he'd built, the chaos he'd conquered. Now, it wavered. A fragile thing tied to a daughter he'd failed and a granddaughter he didn't know. The whispers on the airwaves weren't just Victor's. They were his own past, rising to demand, reckoning. Henry pressed his hand against the glass, the cold grounding him. He wouldn't fight with fists or fury. He'd face this with the same resolve that had carried him this far, quiet, steady, and unbroken. The fire in Henry Caldwell's Lakeshore Drive mansion snapped and hissed, casting a warm glow across the cavernous living room. The marble floor gleamed like a frozen lake underfoot, and the leather armchair creaked as he sank into it, a tumbler of whiskey resting untouched on the side table. Outside, the Chicago skyline glittered through the vast windows, a testament to his dominion. But tonight, that dominion felt like a hollow crown. Victor Marshall's televised ambush at the gala still echoed in his ears. The words, "What kind of man leaves a wife and child?" striking deeper than any rival's blade. Clara's cold rejection yesterday lingered too, her voice a quiet storm. "You don't belong here." Henry had spent decades burying the past, but it was clawing its way back, relentless and unyielding. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the crumpled letter from Clara. "I keep your chair empty." And the note from Lily, her crayon scrawl a faint plea. "Mom says you're important." The papers sat side by side on his knee, fragile relics of a life he'd abandoned. The news had turned his private shame into a public spectacle, and the board was already whispering about damage control. Margaret had left 3 voicemails. Her tone clipped. "We need a statement, Henry. Now." But he hadn't called back. He needed answers first, answers only he could find. His gaze drifted to the bookshelf, its orderly rows of annual reports a monument to his discipline. But something was off. A wooden box, small and weathered, peeked out from behind a stack of binders. He hadn't noticed it before. It wasn't part of Margaret's meticulous decor. Curiosity, rare and unwelcome, pulled him to his feet. Riage box was light, its surface scratched and faded, the kind of thing Ellen, his late wife, might have kept. He lifted the lid, dust swirling in the firelight, and found a slim notebook inside, her handwriting on the cover. For Henry, if you ever come back. His breath caught, a sharp hitch he couldn't suppress. Ellen's script was soft, looping, a ghost of the woman he'd loved before fear drove him away. He opened it, the pages brittle under his fingers, and began to read. October 12th, 1998. The first entry began. The doctor says it's my heart, congestive failure. Clara doesn't know yet. She's 16, strong, but too young for this. I keep hoping you'll walk through the door, Henry. But I know you won't. The words hit like a fist to the gut, stealing the air from his lungs. He sank back into the chair, the notebook trembling in his hands. Ellen had been sick, dying while he'd been brokering deals, building his empire. He flipped the pages, each entry a quiet dagger. Clara stays up late, making tea, pretending she's not scared. I tell her you're busy, but she doesn't believe me anymore. And then later, she found your old jacket today, cried, herself to sleep holding it. I wish you'd stayed, Henry. Not for me, but for her. Henry's throat tightened, a knot he couldn't swallow. He'd left to shield them from his father's chaos, booze-soaked rages, foreclosure notices. But this was worse. Ellen had died waiting, and Clara had carried the burden alone. The final entry, dated weeks before her death, broke him open. Clara's taking care of me now, working after school to pay the bills. She's my rock, Henry. You'd be proud if you knew her. The notebook slipped to his lap, the fire's heat suddenly oppressive. He'd known Ellen was gone, had seen the obituary years ago, a brief mention in the Tribune, but he'd never imagined this. Clara, a teenager, nursing her dying mother while he signed contracts in boardrooms a world away. Dignity, he'd called his absence, a noble sacrifice to spare them his flaws. But it was cowardice, plain and raw, staring back at him from these pages. A soft knock at the door jolted him. He straightened, shoving the notebook under a cushion as if hiding evidence, though his hands shook. Come in, he called, his voice rough but steady. The door opened, and there she was, Lily, her brown hair tangled, her coat too big for her small frame. She clutched a folded piece of paper, her sneakers leaving faint smudges on the marble. Hi, she said, her voice small but clear. Mom didn't know I came. I took the bus. Henry's heart thudded, but he kept his face calm, a mask honed over decades. Lily, he said, rising slowly. What are you doing here? She stepped closer, holding out the paper. A painting, he realized, its colors vivid even in the dim light. Mom made this a long time ago, she said. It's you. She said to keep it safe, but I thought you should have it. He took it, unfolding it with care. The image stole his breath. A younger Henry, stern but smiling, standing by a riverbank, painted in bold strokes of blue and gray. Clara's work, her talent, her memory of him, preserved from 25 years ago. The man in the painting looked strong, worthy, not the hollow shell he felt now. Mom doesn't talk about you much, Lily added, rocking on her heels. But she kept this. I thought, maybe you'd like it. Henry's eyes burned, a sting. He blinked away. He set the painting on the mantel, beside Clara's letter, and looked at Lily, his granddaughter, a living bridge to the daughter he'd lost. Thank you, he said, his voice low, controlled. You shouldn't have come alone. It's late. I'm okay, she said, smiling faintly. I wanted to see you again. He nodded, a lump rising in his throat. I'll call someone to take you home, he said, reaching for his phone. But as he dialed Margaret, his gaze lingered on the painting, on Ellen's notebook, on Lily's trusting eyes. The firelight danced across them, illuminating a truth he couldn't deny. Clara had held on to him, despite everything, and Ellen had died believing in her strength. He'd run from failure, built a fortress of wealth, and called it honor. But honor was in that apartment by the river, in a girl who'd cared for her mother, in a child who'd crossed the city to bring him this gift. Henry turned away, staring into the flames as Margaret's voice crackled through the phone. The past wasn't just alive. It was here, in his house, demanding he face it, and for the first time, he wasn't sure his control would be enough. The conference room at Caldwell Industries buzzed with attention thicker than the Chicago fog outside. Rows of reporters lined the space, their cameras flashing like a storm of fireflies. Each burst a pinprick against Henry Caldwell's resolve. He stood at the podium, his charcoal suit pristine, his silver hair catching the harsh glare of the overhead lights. The air smelled of coffee and anticipation, the murmur of the press a low hum beneath the thrum of his pulse. Victor Marshall's televised attack had ignited a firestorm. Rumors of Henry's abandoned family now splashed across every headline, from tabloids to the Tribune. The board had demanded a response, and Henry had chosen this moment, this stage, to face it. He adjusted the microphone, his movements deliberate, his face a mask of calm forged over decades. The room hushed, eyes locked on him. Some hungry for a scandal, others wary of his next move. Behind him, a screen displayed the Caldwell Industries logo, its clean lines a stark contrast to the chaos Victor had unleashed. Henry's hand brushed the pocket where Clara's letter and Lily's painting rested, a silent anchor amid the storm. Ellen's notebook, with its revelations of her illness and Clara's sacrifice, weighed heaviest of all. He'd spent the night staring into the fire, wrestling with a truth he couldn't outrun. Dignity wasn't in his empire. It was in the family he'd left behind. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice steady, resonant, cutting through the room like a blade through silk. "I'm here to address the allegations made against me. I won't waste your time with denials or theatrics. The truth matters more." A ripple of whispers spread, cameras clicking faster. Henry paused, letting the moment settle, his gaze sweeping the crowd. He saw Margaret in the back, her arms crossed, her expression taut with worry. He saw board members shifting in their seats, their faith in him teetering. And he saw Victor Marshall leaning against a wall near the exit, his silver hair gleaming, his smirk a quiet dare. Henry's blood simmered, but he tamped it down, his jaw tightening only slightly. Control was his weapon. He wouldn't let Victor wield it against him. 30 years ago, he continued, I walked away from my wife, Ellen, and my daughter Clara. I told myself it was for their good, to build something stable, to escape the failures of my own father. I was wrong. Ellen died while I was chasing power and Clara grew up without me. I didn't know the full cost until recently, until I found her letters, until I met my granddaughter Lily. The room erupted, gasps and murmurs colliding like waves. A reporter shouted, "So you admit it?" Another called, "What about the company?" Henry raised a hand, silencing them with a gesture as firm as it was quiet. His eyes found Victor's, a flicker of challenge passing between them, but he didn't flinch. "I'm not here to excuse it," he said. "I made a choice, and it was a selfish one. But Victor Marshall's claims of deceit are a lie. I didn't hide them for profit. I hid them for pride. That ends today. Clara and Lily are my family, and I'll carry that truth whatever it costs." The cameras surged, a barrage of light and sound, but Henry stood unbowed. He'd expected the board's panic, the stock's inevitable dip. Margaret had warned him of both, yet the weight lifting from his chest was worth it. Dignity wasn't in the silence he'd kept. It was in this, standing under the judgment lights, owning his failures without breaking. Victor stepped forward, his voice cutting through the din, like a shard of glass. "Noble words, Henry," he said, loud enough for the mics to catch. "But words don't erase decades of abandonment. I've got proof, letters, records, showing you knew Ellen was sick and ignored her pleas. How's that for dignity?" The accusation landed like a boulder, the room spinning into chaos. Reporters scribbled furiously, board members exchanged glances, and Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Henry's pulse spiked, a drumbeat of shock and doubt. Victor couldn't have those letters. Ellen's notebook had been in his possession, untouched for years. This was a bluff, a fabrication to twist the knife. But the seed of fear took root. Had Ellen written to him, and had he missed it in his climb? He straightened, his hand steady on the podium, his voice rising above the clamor. "Victor," he said, each syllable measured. "You've spent 25 years nursing a grudge over a deal you lost. If you have proof, show it. Otherwise, your lies don't touch me, or my family." Victor's smirk faltered, a crack in his armor, but before he could respond, the door at the back swung open. Clara stepped in, her paint-splattered coat a stark contrast to the room's polish, Lily clinging to her hand. The crowd turned, cameras swiveling, and Henry's breath caught. Clara's eyes met his, fierce and unyielding, but it was Lily. She shielded as she spoke. "Leave her out of this," Clara said, her voice clear, cutting through the noise. "Whatever he did, whatever you think he is, don't drag my daughter into your games." She looked at Victor, then at Henry, her gaze, a blade of its own. "She's not a pawn." Lily peeked out, her small face pale but brave, her rag doll clutched tight. The sight pierced Henry deeper than Victor's words. A child caught in a war he'd started by walking away. He stepped from the podium, ignoring the shouts, and knelt before her, his suit creasing against the floor. "I'm sorry, Lily," he said, his voice low but firm, audible only to her and Clara. "You shouldn't be here for this." Lily tilted her head, her eyes searching his. "Are you really my grandpa?" she whispered. "Yes," Henry said, the word a vow he hadn't known he'd make. He stood, facing Clara. "I didn't ask you to come." "I didn't come for you," she replied, her tone icy but steady. "I came for her." The press swarmed, but Henry turned back to the podium, raising a hand to quiet them. "That's all," he said. "I've said what I came to say. The rest is mine to fix, not yours to judge." He walked off, guiding Clara and Lily toward a side door, his stride unshaken despite the chaos behind him. Victor's voice chased him. "This isn't over, Henry." But Henry didn't turn. Control held him upright, but it was Clara's presence, Lily's trust, that fueled him now. Dignity wasn't in winning this fight. It was in standing, for them, under the lights, without breaking. The glow from the small electric heater in Clara's queen's apartment cast a soft amber light across the worn hardwood floor, a humble rival to the grand fireplace of Henry Caldwell's mansion. The room smelled of brewing coffee and faintly of turpentine, the air warm despite the November chill seeping through the cracked window pane. Henry sat at the wooden table, his charcoal suit jacket draped over the back of a chair, his tie loosened, for the first time in years. Across from him, Clara stood by the stove, stirring a pot of soup, her paint-splattered apron tied tight around her waist. Lily perched on the couch, her rag doll in one hand, a pencil scratching across a sketch pad in the other. 2 days had passed since the press conference, since Clara and Lily had stepped into the storm of flashing cameras and Victor Marshall's venom. The headlines still screamed, "Caldwell's secret family revealed," and the stock had dipped, though not crashed, thanks to a loyal board and a public weary of Victor's theatrics. Henry had driven them home that night, the Bentleys, silence broken only by Lily's sleepy questions. Why were they so loud? He hadn't answered then. But now, here, he sought something he couldn't name. "I didn't expect you to come back," Clara said, her voice low, steady, as she ladled soup into mismatched bowls. She didn't look at him, her focus on the task, a shield, Henry thought, against the weight of his presence. "I didn't expect to either," he replied, his tone even, measured. He watched her hands, rough, capable, the hands of a woman who'd built a life without him. "But I couldn't stay away. Not after everything." She set a bowl in front of him, the steam rising with a faint scent of thyme. "You mean, after you turned my life into a circus?" Her eyes met his, sharp, but not cruel. Lily's school called today. Kids asking if she's famous. She doesn't need that. Henry's chest tightened, a pang of guilt he didn't push away. I didn't want that, he said. I wanted to own the truth, not let Victor twist it. I didn't know you'd come. Clara sat across from him, her own bowl untouched. I didn't plan to, she admitted, her voice softening a fraction. But when I saw the news, saw him dragging Lily into it, I couldn't let him win. Not like that. Lily looked up from her drawing, her brown eyes bright. Mom says you're brave, she said, matter of fact. Standing up there with all those lights. I'd be scared. Henry's throat caught, a lump he swallowed with effort. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his hands clasped to steady them. I was scared, he said, meeting her gaze. But sometimes you have to stand anyway, for the people who matter. She grinned, a small, unguarded smile, and went back to her sketch. Henry felt Clara watching him, her silence heavier than words. He took a sip of the soup. Simple, warm, better than anything his chefs had ever made. It was the first meal he'd eaten in this kind of home in 30 years, and it stirred a memory. Ellen stirring a pot, Clara tugging at his sleeve, a life he'd walked away from. I'm selling half my shares, he said, breaking the quiet. Stepping back from the chairmanship, the money's going to a fund, for kids like Lily, who need art, not headlines. Clara's spoon paused mid-air, her brow furrowing. Why? She asked, suspicion threading her tone. To look good? To buy us back? No, Henry said, his voice firm but not harsh. To fix what I can. I've spent my life building something big, thinking it was honor. But it's not. Honor's here. He gestured to the room, to Lily, to her. I don't expect you to believe me. I just want you to know. She studied him, her eyes searching for a lie but found none. You don't get it, she said finally, setting the spoon down. I don't need your money. I never did. I needed a father. Lily needs a grandfather, not a check. I know, Henry said, and the admission felt like shedding a skin he'd worn too long. That's why I'm here, not to buy anything, just to be here. The heater hummed, filling the silence that followed. Clara rose, clearing the bowls though they were barely touched, her movements brisk but not angry. Henry watched her, then stood, rolling up his sleeves, a gesture he hadn't made since he was a young man fixing pipes in Cicero. He crossed to the counter, picking up a dish towel. What are you doing? Clara asked, pausing with a bowl in hand. Helping, he said simply, drying the first dish she handed him. It was awkward, his hands unpracticed, and a splash of water hit his shirt. Lily giggled from the couch and Clara's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile she quickly hid. You're terrible at this, she said, but there was no venom in it. I'll learn, Henry replied, meeting her gaze. For a moment, something softened between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a crack in the wall. Grandpa Henry, Lily called, hopping off the couch and holding up her sketch. A rough outline of him at the podium, lights blazing behind him. I drew you. See? He took it, his fingers brushing the paper with care. It's perfect, he said, his voice thick. Can I keep it? She nodded, beaming, and scampered back to her spot. Henry set the drawing beside his jacket, a treasure more valuable than any contract. He returned to the dishes, working in silence beside Clara, the clink of ceramic a quiet rhythm. It wasn't much, soup, a sketch, a damp shirt, but it was more than he'd had in decades. I'm not asking you to forget, he said as they finished, his hands still damp. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to be here, Clara, for her, for you if you'll let me. She dried her hands on her apron, her eyes distant. Lily likes you, she said finally. She sees something I don't. Maybe that's enough for now. Henry nodded, accepting the small concession. The heater's glow flickered, a small flame against the vastness of his past mistakes. He'd sold half his empire, stepped out of the spotlight, but this cramped kitchen, this fragile truce was where dignity lived. Not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, steady choice to stay. As he slipped on his jacket, Lily's drawing in his pocket. He felt the first stirrings of a warmth he hadn't known he'd lost. The late November sun hung low over Chicago, its pale light filtering through the bare branches of a small park near Clara's Queen's apartment. Henry Caldwell pushed Lily's swing with a steady rhythm, the creak of the chains blending with her delighted laughter. His coat, a simpler wool one now, not the tailored armor of his upper-class days, flapped gently in the breeze, and his breath fogged in the crisp air. Nearby, Clara sat on a weathered bench, her sketchpad open on her lap, her pencil tracing lines as she watched them. The scene was ordinary, unglamorous, a far cry from the chandeliers and boardrooms of his past life, yet it held a quiet weight Henry hadn't known he craved. 3 weeks had passed since the press conference, since he'd sold half his shares and stepped back from Caldwell Industries. The headlines had quieted. Victor Marshall's fabricated proof had unraveled under scrutiny, his credibility crumbling when a whistleblower exposed his doctored letters. The board had stabilized the stock, and Henry's legacy, though dented, endured. But he hadn't stayed for that. He'd rented a modest house 2 blocks from Clara's, trading Lakeshore Drive's marble for hardwood floors and a single fireplace he'd learned to stoke himself. Dignity, he'd discovered, wasn't in the empire he'd built. It was here, in the slow, steady work of staying. "Faster, Grandpa Henry," Lily called, her brown curls bouncing as she kicked her legs. He obliged, his hands firm on the swings. Chains, a smile tugging at his lips. A real one, not the practiced mask he'd worn for decades. She'd started calling him Grandpa a week ago, unprompted, and each time it landed like a gift he didn't deserve but cherished anyway. "Careful, kiddo," he said, his voice warm, roughened by emotion. "Don't fly off on me." "She's tougher than she looks," Clara said from the bench, her tone dry but laced with something softer. Acceptance, perhaps, or the edge of it. She didn't look up from her sketch, but Henry felt her presence, a steady anchor in this new fragile world they were building. He slowed the swing, letting Lily hop off and scamper to a pile of leaves, her laughter echoing as she tossed them into the air. Henry joined Clara on the bench, his hands resting on his knees, the wool of his coat brushing against her paint-flecked jacket. She flipped her sketchpad closed, revealing a half-finished drawing of Lily mid-swing, her joy captured in bold, fluid lines. "You're good," Henry said, nodding at the page. "Better than good. That fund I started, it's got your name on it now. The Clara Caldwell Art Trust. For kids who need what you give Lily." Clara's pencil stilled, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I didn't ask for that," she said, but there was no bite in it, just wariness, a reflex from years of guarding herself. "I know," Henry replied, his gaze steady. "It's not about asking, it's about what's right. You've given her everything I didn't. This is me giving back in the only way I know how." She studied him, her brown eyes searching his face. Not for lies, he realized, but for permanence. "You're different," she said finally, her voice low. "Not all the way, but enough. Lily sees it. I'm starting to." Henry nodded, a small acknowledgement of a truth he felt in his bones. "I'm not the man who left," he said. "I don't know if I'll ever be the man you needed then. But I'm here now." Clara didn't respond, but she didn't turn away either. They sat in silence, watching Lily chase a squirrel across the grass, her rag doll tucked under her arm. The park was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic, a world apart from the chaos of his old life. Victor had faded into irrelevance, his vendetta a footnote in a story Henry no longer cared to headline. The company thrived without him, a machine he'd built but no longer needed to steer. Freedom, he thought, wasn't in control. It was in letting go. That evening, back at Clara's apartment, Henry knelt by the small fireplace he'd helped install, a practical upgrade, not a grand gesture. He struck a match, the flame catching on the kindling, and Lily plopped beside him, her sketchpad open to a new drawing. The 3 of them in the park, rough but unmistakable. "Look, Grandpa," she said, pointing at the figures. "That's you, and Mom, and me. We're a team now, right?" Henry's throat tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Yeah, kiddo," A team. He took the drawing, setting it on the mantel beside the painting Clara had made of him years ago. A younger Henry, stern but hopeful, now joined by this new family portrait. Clara stepped in from the kitchen, a mug of coffee in each hand. She handed one to Henry, her fingers brushing his. A fleeting touch, unintentional but not withdrawn. "She slipped up last night," she said, nodding toward Lily. "Called you Dad by mistake, caught herself, laughed it off." Henry took a sip, the warmth spreading through him. "I heard worse mistakes," he said, a faint smile breaking through. "I'll take it." Lily yawned, curling up on the couch, her doll clutched tight. Henry pulled a blanket over her, his movements careful, reverent. Clara watched, her expression unreadable, but not cold. "You don't have to keep coming," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's happy. I'm managing." "I know," Henry said, standing to face her. "But I want to. I've spent 30 years running. From my father's mess, from Ellen's love, from you. I'm done running. I don't expect forgiveness, Clara. I just want to be here however you'll have me." She looked at him long and hard, then nodded. A small, decisive motion. "Okay," she said. "For Lily, and maybe for me too." The fire crackled, a small flame holding steady against the night. Henry sat beside her on the couch, Lily's soft breathing filling the space. He pulled out Ellen's notebook from his coat, placing it on the table. A silent offering, a bridge to the past they could face together. Clara's hand hovered over it, then rested there, a tentative claim. The ashes of his old life had settled, silently, beneath this new warmth. Dignity wasn't in the billions he'd amassed or the enemies he'd vanquished. It was in this, in staying, in the slow mending of what he'd broken. Henry leaned back, the fire's glow on his face, and for the first time in decades, he felt whole. Not perfect, not redeemed, but present. And that, he knew, was enough. As the city lights faded into the distance, he stood in the warmth of a modest home, no longer a titan of industry, but a man reclaimed by the quiet strength of those he'd once lost. The empire he'd built paled, beside the laughter of a child and the tentative trust of a daughter, a legacy not of wealth but of presence. Honor, he learned, wasn't forged in boardrooms or headlines, but in the courage to stay, to mend, to love. What did you think of this journey? Drop a like, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart.